Welcome viewers, today we're going to look at runtime selection in decisions. It's a very useful capability that you can tell decisions that based on some rule criteria or outcome that you want to run a specific flow or rule or other designer element, and that process will decide which flow, rule, or designer element to run at runtime. So it makes your process very flexible. So let's show how to build that. So I'm going to create a new folder like I do in all my videos. So I'm going to click on here, create folder, create a new designer project, and I'm just going to call this Runtime Selection. All right, so in Runtime Selection, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a flow, and I'm going to say this is the main flow. This is going to be the flow that's going to call 3 other flows, and it's going to decide to do this at runtime. Now, how we do this is we say, hey, I want to have the run flow step, which is the flow step that we use to call another flow within a flow. When I click on this step, I have the advanced options here that I can expand. Now, in the advanced options here, I can decide whether I want to pick the flow, which just means I'm going to pick what's the next process that decisions is going to run after this flow completes. Or I can say, hey, let's do runtime selection. I mean, what runtime selections expects is it expects the target ID of the system or of the process that you are going to run based on the rule criteria. Every designer element has an ID associated with it, and that's what this particular flow is looking for, a specific flow ID that you want to run. So now, the first thing you need to do is we will need to configure a template flow. Now, what does this template flow have to have? Well, this template flow will have to have 3 things. It will have to have first all of the input data types that you will be using for this process. So let's say I have one flow that's going to be having the accounts input type, and it's going to check to see if the account is admin@decisions.com. If that's one of the potential processes that I could run, then I need to make sure that I have that within the template flow. And let's say I have a second flow that could run at runtime selection that's going to be expecting 2 different numbers and 2 integer inputs. Then I need to make sure that the template flow contains the account type for the first runtime selection and then the input type of the second runtime selection of those 2 numbers. And then finally, if there are any tasks or anything that could pause the flow within the runtime selection, then you need to make sure that you have that within your template flow. So what are the 3 things in summary? So I need to make sure my inputs are the same. I need to make sure that any add tasks, or if any of the runtime selectable flows will have pause steps like add task steps, then I need to make sure that's in the template flow. And then I need to make sure that the outputs are the same as well. So inputs, tasks, and outputs. Those are the 3 things you want to remember when you design your template flow. So I'm just going to connect this thing up right here. And before I do this, I'm going to create the template flow. So I'm going to say create new. I'm going to call this the template flow. And with this template flow, I'm going to do just that. I'm going to have a flow that's going to have an input of the accounts data type. So I'm going to define the input. I'm going to say this is account. I'm going to say that this is account. Boom. I'm going to save this flow, close this. I'm going to make sure that I have 2 numbers because I'm going to do, it's a num1, it's going to be an integer, and then num2. And then I'm going to add this one, and then that will be my inputs for there. Perfect. And let's say I want to output. I'm going to connect, let me grab an add task step, because I will have my third flow have a task that we need to work. Now you may ask, what should I do about the form? Does the form need to have a specific template? No, you can pick whatever form you want. So I'm just going to pick this form. Your form doesn't have to have anything on it, and you don't even really need to even configure this step. You can leave it the way it is, because remember, decisions is just using this as a template. It's just saying, hey, I'm going to use this flow and say, okay, if I need to run this first flow ID to check if the first account, the initiating user account is equal to admin@decisions.com, then I need to have this input. So it's going to check there. And then it's going to just grab the inputs of this template flow and the outputs of the template flow that are relevant to that flow that it will call, and only get the pieces it needs. So that's why it may be take a little getting used to, but you don't need to configure these steps, this add task steps completely. All you have to have is just it here, so Decisions knows to expect a task if a potential runtime selectable flow has one. So it's a little hard to explain, so I'm going to continue demonstrating it. So we have this template flow, which is perfect. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to close this, and then what we're going to do is I'm going to design those 3 flows that I mentioned that I'm going to call via runtime selection. So it's going to be very quick. So I'm going to say this is going to be the is account admin flow. And so this one is going to take in a type of account. And this is also going to be account. Oops. Caps lock is on. There we go. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to close this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have a simple rule. Simple rule. Let's see. String equals. Then I'm going to check to see. Move this one here. Clean up the lines. And then I'm going to say if the account email address equals, I'm saying that's a constant, admin@decisions.com. Perfect. So now what's going to happen is it's going to say, hey, is the account account email address equal to admin@decisions.com? And if it is, it's going to go down the true path. If it isn't, it's going to go down the false path. So very simple flow. All right, and then I'm going to make sure that I save this, close this, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to create another flow, and this one's going to be assign admin something. And this is, I'm going to put in parentheses, this will be the second flow in the process. And so now I'm going to add task step. admin@decisions.com. I'm just going to call this test. I'm going to pick a form. This form I'm going to select. Perfect. That's what I want. And let's just say this will be test data. I'll save this and close it. All right, and then is account admin. Let me change the name of this. I'm going to just add a parenthesis that this is going to be the flow 1. And let's do one more. And this one's going to be sum 2 numbers. Or yeah, add 2 numbers. Add 2 numbers flow. And this is going to be the flow 3. And I'm just going to grab the add step. And I'm going to have my inputs. Num1, which are going to be integers. Num2, which will also be an integer. And then save. Close this. All right, perfect. And actually what I want to do is I'm actually going to output the result. So I'm just going to call this result integer. Now, since I changed this flow to have an output of result, I need to make sure that my template flow also has the result output. So this one's going to be on num1, this one's going to be on num2, and then this one's going to be the result. Oops. Result's going to be add 1 output. All right, perfect. So now that we got this, now let me update my template flow. So I got to edit this. And I need to make sure that it outputs a result. And then I shall call this will be an integer. Okay. Save. Close. Alrighty. So now that my inputs match, this should be good to go. So now I'm going to save this and close. Now, I'm going back to my main flow. How should I determine which flow to run? Well, a frequent paradigm that we have is we combine the truth table with runtime selection. So what that means is over here, in this space right here, I'm actually going to have a truth table that based on some criteria that I decide, I'm going to say, hey, I want you to run a specific flow, and it's going to, based on this result, output a flow ID. So what does that look like? So let's go ahead and configure that. So I'm just going to drag a pick or create truth table, and then I'm going to create it. So create new, and I'm going to call this the determine which flow to run. Right? So this is applicable to many situations. Let's say you're a mortgage lender, and based on someone's credit score and someone's liabilities or someone's assets, you want to run a specific type of flow. Or let's say if you are a medical company, and let's say based on someone's diagnosis of whether the type of cancer they have, their sex, their age, or familial history, then you could say run this flow. So this has a lot of applications, and so my rule is going to be very simplistic just to demonstrate the process on how to build it. But in your scenario, depending on which vector of business that you're running decisions in, this has many applications on how you can tell decisions to determine based on some data to run a specific process via the runtime of your actual process. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's determine some criteria. So let's say if let's see, I'm going to take in a string and say string. This is going to be flow name or string. I'm going to call it flow string. It's just not working today. So we're just going to call this text. Now I'm going to close this, and now if the text equals, and let's say it equals flow 1, flow 2, flow 3. All right. And then what we're going to do is I need to make sure that if the text equals flow 1, flow 2, or flow 3, I need to make sure that I output that specific flow ID. So how do you do that? Well, it's easier if I just say open up this and say open up a new tab. So I'm going to open up a new tab and then navigate to my local server. The reason why I'm doing that is because, oh, and I forgot the one. The reason why I'm doing that is because then I can look at the flows that I have in that folder. So I think it's called Runtime Selection. I just cannot find it today. Refresh this. Let me look back. Base of operations. Okay, so it is in. Okay, so it's in this folder. So let me make this a root folder because I could not find it. Move folder to root. Yes. So runtime selection. Now I can find it easy. So now what I'm going to do is, since this is what I'm going to determine as flow 1, I want to right-click this flow, and then what I want to do is say, let's go to manage, and I want to get the flow ID because that's how decisions determines which flow to run based on the ID. So I'm going to get the flow ID. I can copy text. You can highlight it and do your shortcuts if you're a keyboard wizard. I'm just going to click copy text because I'm just feeling lazy today. And now I'm going to go back to this other tab, which already has my truth table open. So it allows me to easily switch between adding the data and then finding the flow I need to get the ID from. Okay, so now since this is set to Boolean output values, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, let us hover your mouse over the column here. See, like when I hover the column, I have these buttons that appear. When I hover over the column, I have this pencil. I'm going to left-click this pencil, and I'm going to change this output to a string. And then click OK. And then now what I'm going to do is, now since it's accepting a string, which is what an ID is, it's just a long text of numbers and letters and special characters, I'm going to double left click into this cell right here, and I'm just going to paste that ID. So now at any time if the text equals flow1, it's going to run this flow, or it's going to not run the flow, but output this flow ID. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other two. So this one's here, manage, copy the text, paste that in there, switch over, go to flow 3, manage, get flow ID, copy text, switch over, and boom. Now I have those 3 flows. And what do I want to do if, let's say, someone selects an option that's outside of the bounds? I might just say, you know, no flow available or something. No flow, or, yeah, invalid text or whatever. Invalid text. We'll just do it that way if whatever we pass through does not match any of those things. All right, this is perfect. So now I'm going to say if the text equals flow1, then I want to output its ID. If the text equals flow2, I want to output its ID. If the text equals flow3, I want to output this flow ID. Now let's close and save this. And to do this, I'm actually going to, here we go. I'm just going to set up a simple input on this flow. So we're going to call this text, just so that it matches the input of the truth table. Select from flow the truth table. We're going to drag the input text. And then over here, I'm actually going to have this. I'll put instead of a list of strings, so right here, all truth tables default to outputting a list. We want to change that. We just want it to only run the first result. And so I'm going to say return first result. Now notice rules can also be something that's run via runtime selection. And the paradigm would be exactly the same. You would either have a collection of flow IDs based on some criteria, output the specific, not flow ID, a truth table ID to the specific truth table step, and then it will run that particular truth table. So that's all that it really is. You can do this on rules, flows, and I think you can also do it on reports and some other designer elements as well. All right. So going back to the first topic of conversation. So make sure that we check this return only the first result. Now I'm going to save this. And I'm going to just close this. And then let's open back into the main flow. And now what I'm going to do is over here, I'm going to pass in the target ID. So select from flow. We're going to grab the result string. I'm through to it. For the account, I'm going to select the initiating user account. I'm giving all the information that any of the flows will need to run. So let's do, what is current account? That any of the flows would run. And so let's say I had a process that already gave these values like 7. I'm going to use constant values for right now. Boom, and I already got that here. So now what we're going to have, okay, so it looks like the reason why I have an error is because this truth table also outputs a result. And so they're of 2 different types. So that's why it's yelling at me. So to fix this, I'm just going to rename this to truth table result. There we go. And now it goes away. Now I need to make sure that I just have to remap the target ID because I changed that variable name. But that's something to be aware of, that if you're outputting 2 different variable names and they're defined as different types, then Decisions is not gonna like that. Okay, now you can see how my flow is now configured. So this is going to be determine flow to run truth table. Okay. Now I'm just going to debug this. Now, since I'm expecting a certain text, I'm going to run the flow1, and we'll see if it runs the flow. And as you can see, that my flow has now run. It said, hey, my truth table said I have a text of flow1, and because flow1 equals flow1, it's going to output this ID. And when it outputted that ID, Decisions then decided to run that flow that I created to evaluate whether an account is admin.decisions.com. Now let's run this again. Let's do the other ones. This is going to be flow 2. I'm going to do this. And now you can see here that with my flow 2 that I have the test data of the task that I've been assigned for flow 2. And it displays it here as well. Or actually, I'm sorry, that's not the adding. This is the assign admin something. So here is the task that's given to the admin user. So the rule ran and said, hey, flow 2 equals flow 2. Flow 2 does not equal flow 1, so that's why it said I'm not running this ID. And then flow 2, let me minimize this, equals flow 2. So decisions decided to run this ID, right? Do this. I'm just going to complete this task so I can complete that flow, and that flow is now done. Now we're going to run another session. I'm going to say flow 3. This is the one where I should sum two numbers together. Yep, add two number flow. My English is awesome. So now decisions, since flow 3, where's the rule? There we go. Flow 3 did not equal flow 1, it did not equal flow 2, but it equaled flow 3. So it output this ID. And now in decisions, when I go back to the main flow, you see that the template flow ran and it executed the add two numbers flow. And when I look at the output of this step, I have 96 because I think it was 89 plus 7 is 96. So this one ran as expected. And so that's the runtime flow. And I can also test it again further to say if, let's say I have flow 4 and there's no flow 4, then what's going to happen is that will error out because what I outputted was invalid text. And there's no template flow assigned to run for invalid text. So that's expected behavior because I didn't configure like a default flow ID. And now I could have and said, hey, if someone selects a flow that's not available, then I can say here, that's not a, please select another flow or something like that shows a pop-up. If invalid text, I can just have a rule. So string equals right here. And this is false. And then I'm just going to do a show pop-up right here and just say I'll say this is error, and I'll call this invalid, and invalid selection has been made. Oops, all right, do this. Okay, and so now what I'm checking for is if the truth table result equals invalid text. Invalid text, there we go. And so now let's say if I do flow 4 again, or let's just say I just do text, and now I have error, an invalid selection has been made. So I handle that error better by just checking to make sure that it equaled something within that truth table. So that's runtime selection. I hope you guys learned something from this. Remember, the key things you need to remember in runtime selection is you need to configure a template flow that you pick. You need to make sure that the pick or create step in decisions or the run flow step in decisions has the selection type runtime selection selected. Give it a template flow. The template flow should contain all the inputs that all of the possible subflows it could call. It should contain an add task step just in case if one of the subsequent flows you will call has an add task step. And then it should also have all the outputs, all the potential outputs that any of these subsequent subflows could have. And then remember, when you go into your template flow, you don't need to configure everything, right? You saw how mine has these exclamation point errors. You don't need to configure everything because decisions is not running this flow. The decisions are just looking at this like a blueprint and saying, hey, if one of these flows has any one of these blueprints, use it and only use it for the ones that the subflow needs, and then run that subflow. So that's what you have to be remembering when you design a template flow. It doesn't have to be configured, but its inputs and any add task steps and any outputs must be configured.